For 5 long years, a shadow of terror gripped northern England. Women were disappearing, one after another, their lifeless bodies found later in horrifying conditions. The streets grew quieter, and fear filled the hearts of millions. A name whispered in fear and anger, the Yorkshire Ripper. But who was the man behind the name? Peter Sutcliffe wasn't just another criminal. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, a man who lived a double life, working by day and unleashing unimaginable brutality by night. Today, we're diving deep into the twisted mind of one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. We'll uncover how Sutcliffe evaded capture for years, why his crimes struck fear into an entire nation, and, most chillingly, the dark motives that fueled his spree of terror. And here's the thing, this isn't just another story. It's a journey into the darkness of the human mind, a look at how evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Trust me, you'll want to stick around until the very end. There's a bombshell revelation about how this killer was finally caught that will leave you absolutely speechless. So, before we get into the chilling details, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this is just one of many deep dives into the world's most chilling true crime stories. And while you're at it, drop a comment below, what do you think drives someone to commit such horrifying acts? Let's hear your thoughts. Now, let's go back to the beginning, before the murders, before the terror, to the man Peter Sutcliffe was before the world knew his name. Was he born evil, or did something in his life twist him into the monster we now know as the Yorkshire Ripper? To understand the monster, we must first understand the man. Peter Sutcliffe was born on June 2, 1946, in Bingley, a small town in West Yorkshire, England. At first glance, his upbringing appeared typical, an ordinary working-class family, living an ordinary life. But scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find the cracks in what seemed like a normal foundation. Peter was the son of John and Kathleen Sutcliffe. His father, a proud and outgoing man, had high expectations for Peter. He wanted his son to be strong, athletic, and full of confidence, just like him. But Peter? He was the complete opposite. Small, quiet, and shy, he often found himself the target of ridicule and bullying, especially by his father. John would mock him for being weak and failing to live up to his expectations. This constant pressure created a rift between father and son, one that Peter carried with him for the rest of his life. His inability to meet his father's ideals planted the seeds of resentment and insecurity, seeds that would later bloom into something far darker. As a child, Peter was an introvert who preferred solitude over socializing. He spent hours alone, avoiding interactions, and by his teenage years, this isolation grew. He dropped out of school at the age of 15, and his future seemed bleak. But it wasn't just his father's criticism or his school struggles that shaped him. There was something else, something far more sinister. Peter developed an unhealthy fascination with death and violence at a young age. His friends later recalled how he would spend time in graveyards, seemingly drawn to the idea of mortality. Some said he was obsessed with the macabre, an obsession that only deepened as he grew older. But what made this quiet, awkward boy evolve into a brutal killer? Was it the bullying? The isolation? Or was it something far more psychological? Experts argue that Sutcliffe showed early signs of psychopathy, a lack of empathy and an inability to connect with others. And as we'll see, these traits would define the darkest chapters of his life. Yet, Peter's early life wasn't all isolation and ridicule. He did find a sense of purpose as he entered adulthood. He started taking odd jobs and eventually found steady work as a truck driver. For a while, it seemed like he was finally settling into an ordinary life. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, something sinister was brewing, something no one could see coming. And then there was his relationship with women. Peter Sutcliffe had a complicated, often disturbing view of women, shaped in part by his early relationships. His obsession with control and domination would later become a defining feature of his crimes. Here's where it gets chilling. Those who knew Peter described him as polite, even likable. He blended into society so seamlessly that no one would have suspected the horrors he was capable of. This ability to hide in plain sight would allow him to evade capture for years, even as the bodies began to pile up. So, what do you think shaped Peter Sutcliffe into the monster he became? Was it his upbringing, his isolation, or something deeper? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because the story is about to get even darker. Up next, we'll explore how Peter Sutcliffe transitioned from an ordinary man to a notorious killer, and how his crimes turned northern England into a hunting ground of terror. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. It was the late 1970s, an era marked by disco music, political unrest, and social change. But in Yorkshire, something far more sinister was lurking in the shadows. A killer, who would later be known as the Yorkshire Ripper, had begun his reign of terror. His name was Peter Sutcliffe. But how did this seemingly ordinary man evolve into one of the most feared serial killers in history? In 1975, Sutcliffe's violent tendencies took a terrifying turn. After years of harboring deep-seated rage and frustration, Peter finally snapped. His first victim was a woman named Wilma McCann, a mother of 4, who worked as a prostitute to support her family. On October 30, 1975, Wilma was out on the streets in Leeds when Peter Sutcliffe found her. The two exchanged only a few words before he attacked. With a hammer and a sharpened screwdriver, Sutcliffe savagely murdered Wilma, leaving her body in a remote area. The crime was brutal, but what was even more chilling was the methodical way in which Sutcliffe executed his attack. He didn't just kill her, he made sure she suffered. Wilma's murder was the first in a series of violent crimes that would stretch across 5 long years, claiming the lives of 13 women and leaving countless others wounded. But here's the twist: at the time, no one knew that these killings were connected. You see, Sutcliffe was clever. He meticulously planned his attacks, choosing victims who were vulnerable, women who worked as prostitutes, women who were out at night on their own. Sutcliffe would often approach them under the guise of offering money for sex, then, without warning, he would strike. In the beginning, the police weren't even sure if the killings were the work of one person. Each victim had been attacked in a different way, and there was no consistent pattern. Some victims were stabbed, others were hit with blunt objects. The only thing linking these murders together was the brutality of the crimes. The public was terrified. A sense of dread hung over the streets of Yorkshire, and the media dubbed the killer the Yorkshire Ripper. But what the public didn't know was that Peter Sutcliffe was hiding in plain sight, living a double life, working as a truck driver by day and hunting women by night. As the killings continued, Sutcliffe's confidence grew. But his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He was leaving more and more clues, yet the police were still no closer to finding him. They had no idea that Sutcliffe's motive wasn't just about anger, it was about something deeper, something more personal. What many didn't realize was that Sutcliffe was not just killing for the thrill. He was driven by a warped sense of justice. Sutcliffe believed that the women he murdered were evil and that he was doing society a favor by eliminating them. He justified his actions in his twisted mind, convincing himself that his violence was somehow righteous. But, despite the growing number of victims, Sutcliffe's dark urges didn't stop. He was relentless. As the bodies piled up, the police became more desperate, but Sutcliffe always stayed one step ahead. And then, in 1977, something unexpected happened. Sutcliffe nearly got caught. He was stopped by the police after being spotted in a suspicious vehicle near one of his crime scenes. But when they searched his car, they found nothing but a simple toolkit. He was allowed to go free, a missed opportunity that haunted the investigation. Yet, despite this close call, Sutcliffe continued his killing spree. The police were still in the dark, chasing down dead ends, while Sutcliffe remained anonymous, watching from the shadows. At this point, you might be wondering, how was Sutcliffe able to evade capture for so long? Was it his careful planning, or were the police simply too slow to connect the dots? What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with this chilling case. The twists in this story are about to get even darker. As the bodies continued to mount, so did the panic. By now, everyone in Yorkshire knew about the Yorkshire Ripper. The media were relentless, and fear gripped every community. Women stayed indoors after dark, and families lived in constant dread. The killer's reign of terror was in full swing, and the police were under enormous pressure to solve the case. But despite the increasing public fear and the growing pile of evidence, the police seemed to be spinning their wheels. How could one man commit so many murders without leaving a trace? The killer was incredibly meticulous, and his ability to avoid capture left detectives baffled. For years, the police followed several leads, but each one ended in frustration. Early on, the police made a critical error that would haunt them for months. In 1976, a letter and a tape recording arrived at a local newspaper, supposedly from the killer himself. The letter was riddled with taunts, and the tape contained a chilling message. The killer mocked the police for their inability to catch him and bragged about how easy it was to murder women without getting caught. The media went wild, and public fear escalated. But what the police didn't realize at the time was that the letter and tape were not from Sutcliffe. They were a hoax, the work of an attention-seeking individual who wanted to be part of the gruesome fame surrounding the murders. But despite the hoax, this would become a defining moment in the investigation. The police were now flooded with false leads, and the public's fear only grew. The killer was still out there, but who was he? For the police, this was a crucial turning point. They now had a profile of the killer, a man who was white, in his 30s, and possibly lived in or near the area where the murders were happening. But this description wasn't enough. The investigators had no idea that the man they were looking for was already in their grasp, lurking in plain sight. In 1977, a breakthrough came, but it was nearly overlooked. Sutcliffe had been pulled over by the police in a routine stop after being spotted near one of the crime scenes. He was questioned and released after being cleared, thanks to his false alibi and the fact that his car didn't contain any of the usual tools of the trade. But here's where it gets shocking. Sutcliffe wasn't the only man being investigated at the time. At one point, the police thought the killer could be a man named Wearside Jack, who was allegedly involved in the hoax letters and tape recordings. This led the police down a dangerous path, distracting them from their real suspect, Peter Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe was practically living under the police radar. He had the perfect cover, a well-established, unremarkable job as a truck driver, a wife, and a reputation as a quiet, polite man. He had learned to live a double life, and it was a perfect deception that worked in his favor. But even as the investigation seemed to stall, Sutcliffe's rage only intensified. His attacks were becoming more frequent and more violent. Yet, somehow, he kept slipping through the fingers of the law. With every passing year, the fear and frustration grew, not only for the victims and their families but also for the police who were no closer to solving the case. Now, think about that for a second. The killer was right there, under the police's nose, but they couldn't see him. How did Peter Sutcliffe manage to stay under the radar for so long? Was it pure luck, or was the police investigation really that flawed? What's your take on the missed opportunities? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. The shocking twist to this story is coming up next. By 1980, Peter Sutcliffe had committed 13 murders and attempted the lives of countless others. His brutal spree had terrorized Yorkshire for 5 long years, and the public was no longer just frightened, they were furious. The police had failed to catch him, and the pressure to solve the case had reached its peak. But as we now know, it wouldn't be long before Sutcliffe's reign of terror came to a shocking end. In January of 1981, fate intervened. Sutcliffe, known for his ability to blend into society, made a critical mistake. He was driving his car late at night when he was spotted by 2 police officers in Sheffield, an area that had been rocked by a recent attack. The officers were on high alert, and they immediately thought something seemed off about Sutcliffe. They decided to pull him over. Now, Peter Sutcliffe had been caught before, remember, he'd been stopped in 1977 and released, but this time, things were different. Sutcliffe was behaving suspiciously, and his alibi didn't add up. The officers decided to search his car, and inside, they found a hammer and a screwdriver, tools that were eerily similar to those used in his previous murders. Sutcliffe was arrested on the spot. When news of his arrest broke, the world was stunned. The Yorkshire Ripper, who had evaded capture for so long, had finally been caught. But the most shocking part of all was what came next, Sutcliffe's confession. During his interrogation, Sutcliffe made a chilling revelation. He admitted to being the Yorkshire Ripper, claiming responsibility for the murders of 13 women and the brutal attacks on 7 others. But what was truly shocking was the reason behind his killings. Sutcliffe revealed that he believed he was on a mission from God, a mission to rid the world of prostitutes and evil women. He had convinced himself that his killings were justified, that he was serving a higher purpose. Peter Sutcliffe's distorted view of the world and his twisted motivations were truly disturbing. He claimed that he had been inspired by voices in his head, telling him to kill. Sutcliffe even described how he felt cleansed after each murder, as if he were somehow purging the world of sin. The idea that he could justify such brutality was enough to leave anyone horrified. But the chilling truth was even darker. Sutcliffe's obsession with prostitutes wasn't just about morality, it was about his deep-seated hatred of women. His victims were not just random targets, they were specifically chosen because they represented the women Sutcliffe despised. He resented women who were independent, sexually liberated, and in his warped mind, immoral. His hatred ran so deep that he took pleasure in causing them pain. Yet, despite his confession, Peter Sutcliffe's motives were still puzzling. What made him snap? What triggered his violent rage? Was it just his delusions, or was there something more to his past that pushed him to commit these horrific acts? Sutcliffe's upbringing certainly provides some clues, but his motivations remain one of the darkest mysteries in criminal history. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Sutcliffe was charged with 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. His defense claimed that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and that his mental state had played a role in his crimes. The prosecution, however, argued that Sutcliffe was fully aware of his actions, and that he had planned and carried out his attacks with methodical precision. The jury ultimately found Sutcliffe guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But even in prison, Sutcliffe's behavior remained disturbing. He continued to deny that he was fully responsible for his actions, and even claimed that he was unfairly labeled as the Yorkshire Ripper. His delusions persisted, and he remained a dangerous, unpredictable figure throughout his time behind bars. But what about the victims? The real tragedy of Peter Sutcliffe's story lies not in the twisted mind of the killer, but in the lives he destroyed. The families of Sutcliffe's victims had to live with the pain and heartbreak of their loss every single day. These were women with families, friends, and futures, women who never got a chance to live out their dreams because of Sutcliffe's brutality. Let me know in the comments what you think about Sutcliffe's confession and his twisted rationale for his killings. Do you think he was truly insane, or was it a defense to escape the harsh consequences of his actions? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can stay updated on more chilling stories like this one. There's more to this case than meets the eye. Peter Sutcliffe's capture brought an end to one of the most terrifying chapters in British criminal history. But the story doesn't end with his conviction. In fact, some of the most powerful parts of this case lie in the aftermath: what happened to the families, how the justice system changed, and how Sutcliffe's reign of terror continues to haunt us to this day. Let's start with the victims. While Sutcliffe had been sentenced, the families of the women he murdered were left to pick up the pieces. Many of them had waited years for justice, and though Sutcliffe's capture provided closure, it also reopened old wounds. Mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers who had lost their loved ones were thrust back into the spotlight. The media was relentless in covering every aspect of the case, and for many families, this made the grieving process even harder. What's more, there was a lingering sense of injustice. Sutcliffe may have been behind bars, but for some families, his punishment could never match the pain he caused. Life imprisonment wasn't enough to undo the loss, the heartbreak, or the trauma they had endured. And for the survivors of his attacks, the women who lived to tell the tale, the scars were both physical and emotional. Some of them struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by the knowledge that they had come face to face with pure evil. But the victims' stories didn't end with tragedy. Many of the families and survivors became powerful advocates for change. They spoke out about the failures in the police investigation, the way women were treated during that time, and the stigma surrounding victims of violence. In their darkest moments, these families found the strength to turn their grief into action, pushing for reforms that would make the world a safer place. One of the most significant changes sparked by the Yorkshire Ripper case was in law enforcement. The investigation into Sutcliffe's crimes had been marred by mistakes, miscommunication, and a shocking amount of sexism. The police had received countless tips, including one from Sutcliffe's own friend, yet they had failed to connect the dots. Worse still, many of the victims were dismissed because they were believed to be sex workers. This prejudice allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killing spree for far longer than he should have. In the years that followed, the British police force underwent a massive overhaul. New procedures were introduced to ensure better communication between departments, and there was a renewed focus on treating all victims with dignity and respect. The case also highlighted the importance of using technology in investigations, something that was sorely lacking during the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the case was on society itself. Sutcliffe's crimes forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about violence against women. At the time, there was a widespread belief that certain women, those who were promiscuous, those who walked alone at night, those who didn't fit society's ideal, were somehow asking for it. The Yorkshire Ripper case shattered this myth. His victims came from all walks of life: mothers, daughters, students, sex workers. Sutcliffe's brutality didn't discriminate, and this made it clear that no one was safe from the threat of violence. This realization sparked a wave of activism. Women across the UK took to the streets, demanding better protection, more accountability, and an end to victim blaming. The Reclaim the Night marches became a symbol of resistance, a powerful reminder that women would no longer be silenced or shamed for wanting to feel safe in their own communities. Here's a question for you: do you think society has learned enough from cases like this to protect vulnerable individuals today? Or do we still have a long way to go? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the world's most chilling true crime stories. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive. Even after his conviction, Sutcliffe remained a source of controversy. Initially imprisoned at Parkhurst Prison, he was later transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility, after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Here, Sutcliffe lived under far less restrictive conditions than in a standard prison, sparking outrage among the victims' families and the public. But Sutcliffe's time at Broadmoor was far from peaceful. In 1997, he was attacked by a fellow inmate who slashed his face with a pen, leaving him partially blind in one eye. Later, in 2010, the courts ruled that Sutcliffe could never be released, solidifying his life sentence without parole. Even as he aged and his health declined, Sutcliffe's name continued to make headlines. When he passed away in 2020 from complications related to COVID-19, his death was met with a mixture of relief and renewed pain for the families of his victims. For some, it marked the end of an era, a final chapter in a story that had haunted them for decades. Today, the story of Peter Sutcliffe serves as a chilling reminder of humanity's darkest potential. His crimes shocked the world, but they also sparked a movement, a demand for justice, accountability, and change. The Yorkshire Ripper's victims may be gone, but they are far from forgotten. Their stories live on, not just as a warning, but as a testament to the resilience of those who fight for a better future. If you found this story as powerful and thought-provoking as I did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more true crime deep dives. And don't forget to leave a comment: what do you think society can do to prevent tragedies like this in the future? Your voice matters, and I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay safe and take care.